So we're very excited tonight to have with us Chandra Alexandre, who is the CEO of Community Action Marin. She is committed to providing a trauma-informed approach to helping people of low income on the path to self-sufficiency. She is inspired by local solutions to global problems and work to ensure that individuals and communities have the confidence, access, policies, and support they need to achieve their dreams. She is a home-birth advocate, a lover of Sanskrit, and a champion for equity. And we are also blessed and thrilled to have with us Reverend Marcus Hartlief, who serves as the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Marin's developmental minister, which means they're working on 5 goals over 5 years to build organizational health. He grew up locally in Oakland and Berkeley and lives in the East Bay, again now with his wife Emily, and son Henry, who needs a big happy birthday shout out as he turns 4 this Sunday. He holds a Master of Divinity from Star King at the Graduate Theological Union, where his teachers included Buddhists, Catholics, Sufis, Jews, pagans, and Protestants of every kind. And before returning to the Bay Area to serve the UU congregation of Marin, he served congregations in New York and British Columbia. So also please welcome Marin. So they're going to take you on a journey today that helps you in your own inspiration and reflection around spirituality and social action, after which we'll have a process for us to ground that individually. But I want to start by just asking them a question, and then they'll take it from there. And the question I'd like them to respond to is, what grounds you in this intersection of social action and your spiritual tradition? Take it away.
We didn't talk about who was going to go first. Ken. Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
I'll get to your question, Scott, but I'm going to take a little time to introduce myself first. And to do that, I want to share a little bit of a family story. Coming to Marin, I just started serving the UU congregation here about a year ago. And it's my first time really getting to know Marin, but it is also kind of a homecoming because one of my moms, you need to know I have 2 moms, and one of my moms was moved to Marin forcibly by her Presbyterian preacher father when she was 12. And she did not particularly enjoy being a preacher's kid. And she feels like there must have been something she did in a previous life to now have been cursed with a preacher's son, and actually my other mom became a minister as well. So, but the point of the story is actually my grandfather. His name was Henry Kaisinga, and he taught at San Anselmo Theological Seminary and served the San Anselmo Presbyterian Church. But Henry was a complicated man. I never got to meet him. He was a towering preacher, they say. He towered in the pulpit. He taught homiletics at the seminary. And he was gay, and he was closeted his whole life. And when my mom was in her late 20s, he was murdered. Somebody picked him up in a gay bar and went home with him and then murdered him. And this trauma, of course, as you can imagine, rippled through our family. And one of the particularly challenging parts of it is the silence around his life and his sexuality. His wife, my grandmother, wouldn't talk about it till the day she died. But a few years later, after he died, my mom, Francie, met my other mom, Laurel, and they ended up getting married, or what we then called a commitment ceremony, in 1983. And then I was born in 1986, and then my brother was born in 1990, and when my brother was born, they wanted to cross-adopt us, to have that be a real legal unification of our family. And the lawyer at the time when the judge approved that cross-adoption, the lawyer said, take a picture of this moment. We have this picture of the 4 of us. take a picture of this moment, it's the most the state will ever recognize your family. And so then we had that picture, as well as a picture of the original commitment ceremony sitting on the table when, in our living room in 2008, my moms were finally legally married.
Yay.
And yay. And I remember asking my mom that day, what would your dad have thought about this? In 30 years, how much our culture has changed. And she said he couldn't have imagined the world like this. Couldn't have imagined me getting married to another woman. And so what grounds me in looking towards the future for social change is that question of what will my grandchildren take for granted and know is just how it should be. How could it ever have been otherwise that I can't even imagine now?
I'm sitting with your story and noticing how many stories I want to tell and share about myself and about the resonances. And those are powerful, and I'm hoping that maybe some of those intersections will come up in our conversation. I want to share a little bit about who I am as well. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact. I'm going to start with a real appreciation for this place, and a grounding in my ancestors, and a grounding in this land, and a grounding in the indigenous peoples of this land. Because what I recognize is that who I am, who I have become, really rests on so many others and so many stories. Many of those stories I don't know. And so all I can do is share with you a piece of my story that I've pulled a thread of to share with you, because I feel like it perhaps in the telling can most connect us into this dialogue around our individual commitments and the way in which, as Scott said earlier, we show up, and by showing up, the presence of who we are in our values and in our choices then grounds us in a statement about social justice and activism. And sometimes it's merely in that breath and in that presence that the divine is realized, because who we are makes a statement about truly what matters, and it connects us to someone else in a place of truth that is very naked in its reality. In the, as some people I know like to say, in the for real, for real. And so a little bit about me. So yes, I'm the CEO of Community Action Marin, and I am honored to be part of the Marin community. I've been the CEO for about 1.5 years now, and the work of the agency is to serve people of low income in this community. And so I feel, and I'll share with you, very deeply connected, yes, to that mission, but born out of a very deeply personal place of what I think the medicine is for our society, and I think that medicine is the work of social justice. So about me, I am from New York, and in the context of a spiritual conversation, I am one of about, roughly, I think as of, I'll up the number a little bit, as about, the last data we have is about 2006 that I read on the internet this morning. I'm one of about 5,000 Puerto Rican Hindus. There are not very many of us. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit of my story about how I got there, not about the Puerto Rican part, but about the Hindu part. And to say that I grew up in New York, I grew up in Queens, and learned a lot about social activism in my family for a variety of different reasons, but I learned a lot about what it means to be in one's truth growing up in New York. There's a lot of what it means to be for real in New York. If you've never been there, you should try it at least once. And so went to college in New York, in Manhattan actually, moved to Switzerland for a couple of years. When I was at college, I studied philosophy and religion. And it wasn't until I got to Switzerland that I started shifting my perspective from very Western-focused studies to a little bit more of a global perspective. And it started to open my eyes, being in the European context, to what lay beyond the Asian context. And I realized that there was more about how I wanted to connect to who I was and what my purpose was. And so I left Switzerland. I retired from being a diplomat after one tour of duty, and I moved to California. And so I've been in California now for a little over 25 years. So grad school really was inspired by, again, coming back to purpose, or coming back to my beliefs, and I'll touch on those beliefs in a second, because I think it's an important part of my story and our conversation in answer to this: how do we find ourselves in the intersection of who we are, what we believe, and how we show up in service to the work of creating the medicine for the future, so that we can have future generations who say, wow, you know, was it really like that? That's certainly my hope. So I wound up exploring and opening the box on philosophy and psychology, and pursued a doctorate, and went to India to do my doctoral fieldwork, and had a number of different experiences there. Initially, my research was about social movements for environmental justice, primarily in the ways in which women would show up as leaders, and what motivated them in their leadership around social justice and action. And then I was in a situation where I was very fearful for my life. I was in a very difficult situation in a rural part of West Bengal in eastern India. And I went to a temple to make an offering and to say thank you. And I won't go into the whole story, but I emerged from that experience after saying that I wasn't going to go back to my field work, and I was going to stay where I was. And again, fast forward, I converted to Hinduism. I received Diksha in 1998. I was initiated into a spiritual lineage and tradition. And I've come back and tried to live those spiritual values in and through who I am as a woman, in and through who I am as a leader, and how I show up in the work. And I will say that this time of my life and taking on this role, leading community action, where it is so powerful, because the mission of the agency and the why I do what I do is the first time in my life that I've ever experienced this alchemical marriage of commitment to purpose, deeply rooted in all of who I am. And to be able to go to work and say, this is all of me, is so beautiful and so for real, and so often not what's possible. And to say that I can be fully who I am in that way, I recognize as incredible privilege. Incredible privilege. Because how hard is it for so many who are disenfranchised to not be able to do that? So I want to seed some of our answers and further conversation with a statement about my beliefs and values that I think are really important. And if I were to say, here's what I brought back from India in a nutshell, this would be it. That there are really 5, I would say, core beliefs, or core maybe principles, values. There are lots of words I can put around this without going into all of the philosophy or all the text or all of the stuff around the nuggets. But the nuggets are really these 5. The first is that the body matters. When we think about what it means to be an activist and the importance of leading in the fullness of who we are, showing up whole and healthy, self-care, compassion for oneself is so critically important. And that embodiment can take many different forms and look many, many different ways. But that's one nugget, and maybe we'll come back to that. The second is around a principle or idea of cyclicity, the eternal return, the connection to the cycles of ourselves and of nature, the realization of the importance of not a beginning to an ending in some teleological sense, like that's where we're headed. but a return again and again of life and death and rebirth. And you don't even need to believe in reincarnation to get what I'm saying, but the coming and going of the seasons and the connection to the ins and outs and flows of each and every day. So cyclicity is another nugget or principle. The third is this idea of relationality. And I might just say a sense of belonging or connection. And I love how you touched on it in your story, because the connection of people and thinking about people across generations and being all of who we are. We can riff on these. But relationality in a very deep sense of when we think about, I think it was mentioned earlier, the problems of isolation in our communities, the challenge of leading a healthy, full, and whole life when we're disconnected. So what does it mean to have the ability to access another heartwarming person in a space of trust and love and compassion? So relationality. The last two are a little bit maybe more difficult, but I'll just share them with you because I think they're very important when we're talking about social justice. To bring into ideas of the shadow or the things that we don't often like to address or think about, whether it's someone who's homeless on the street, whether it's difficult conversations about race. And so the idea of, and think about mythology for a second, think about the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, the idea of going into the underworld to retrieve what must be retrieved, perhaps to heal. And a journey of personal transformation in service to social justice and social transformation. That the idea of doing that journey with intentionality of going into our own shadow or our own underworld, delving into the chthonic, is so deeply important as we think about those who would benefit, let's say, from a deeper relationship with us and with others. And I think that work is incredibly important. And then the final is really this idea of the word that I would use is, I don't know if my husband's still here, but he'll laugh, is the antinomian, is the recognition of, he didn't know that word before he met me, the recognition of that which sits outside and isn't considered normal or normalized by society, is the subaltern, is the disenfranchised, is the devalued and unrecognized, and in the words of Audre Lorde, bringing the marginal then to center again and again and again is the work of our social justice pathway, the medicine that we need in our society. So if I were to say that that's what I learned in India, then I'm really delighted to be able to share that crystallization of a very vast, wide, and beautiful tradition with you in this way. So thank you.
So, one of the things we talked about as we were just preparing to talk with you all when we first met was, well, Chandra asked me, how do you do this work with the demographics that you're working with there at the Unitarian Universalist congregation, this community that tends to be older, whiter, more well-educated, which is also true of this greater area, right? I remember my mom telling me, so growing up in the East Bay, and my mom who had spent her teenage years here in Marin, the only line about Marin was, oh yeah, it's that place where they didn't want Bart to come, right? And I've been reading lately, it's a more complicated story than that. But there's this kernel of truth there, right? Who we are in this place. And to become aware of our social location in the context of the pain in the world is an excruciating experience. And I asked myself and I asked the congregations I work with about what it is that brings us into the work of doing social justice. What is it that calls us into that work? And for a lot of folks, the call comes from that initial moment of pain, and from it the guilt and weight of I have to do something to make up for this privilege that I can't escape from. And I've seen too many conversations go horribly, horribly wrong from that place. You know what I'm talking about? And so, another framework that I got from Dr. Isay Barnwell taught me. She's the singer with Sweet Honey in the Rock. You know them? She would sing that song, "There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul," to heal the sin-sick soul. "There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole," and to make the wounded whole, to heal the sin-sick soul and to make the wounded whole. And it resonates so much with, I think, what we were just talking about, Chandra. It is the same balm. It's the same balm that's healing the sin-sick soul. And of course, where that song is coming from, the sin-sick soul, that's us white folks. And the wounded are those who we have enslaved and oppressed. And so, how to connect with that balm, and in the Christian tradition where that song comes from, Jesus is that balm. But that balm takes many forms and many shapes. And what is that balm in your tradition, in your community? And how do we access it through the body, as you're just talking about? But I as Unitarian Universalists, again, just to that first question, we are inheritors of the Enlightenment way of thinking, right? Or the Enlightenment, as one of my teachers would call it. Really, some shadow to that tradition that we are looking more deeply at now, I think, or just starting to. And the cost, the pain that we are in, has to do with the cost to ourselves of buying into this story that the mind is good and the body is bad, that the thinking is higher than the physical, and therefore everything that gets ascribed to both of those, right? The whiteness is the mind, darkness is the body, male is the mind, female is the body, right? All of these layers of oppression that get ascribed to this dichotomy. And the healing that we are in need of is a return to a whole integrated self, to knowing that the wisdom of the body has been clamoring for our attention. And it's not true that I think, therefore I am. It's true, as one of my teachers would say, that I've felt the scratches of blackberries being stung by salt seawater, therefore I am. I've tasted oranges, therefore I am. Right? I've laughed and cried with people who I love. And it's that laughter and that crying, that full aliveness, that calls me into real work of social justice. Right? That calls me into the real work of relationship, in which my heart can be broken open. Yeah.
We can just sit in that. It's a beautiful picture, and the idea of the willingness in that broken openness to be vulnerable and simultaneously be strong in that nakedness that I mentioned, because that's our truth, that's who we are. And if we can do that and have the courage to do that in the face of difficult conversations and challenges, then I think we have a real chance for healing and a real chance for growth and learning. And it's certainly my hope that we do. I'm a very optimistic person, and it's certainly my hope that part of what we're doing tonight is being with one another in a way that helps to hold potential and possibility, and certainly give us a crack, an opening to, well, wow, we're actually willing to have a conversation about things that we don't often perhaps talk about. And maybe we do have to create intentional spaces like this to talk about that broken, open, wounded self, and be with others in the journey toward healing and wholeness. That's certainly my hope. That's what we're doing with one another tonight.
would you say more about, 'cause I really just know very little so far about Community Action Network and what that, and I guess through this lens of breaking open, and I imagine that that's a daily part of the work, but what does that look like? What does that feel like to be in day in and day out?
Okay, we have.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking. So yeah, Community Action Marin has been around for over 50 years, and the face of poverty, in some ways hasn't changed very much. And yet what we know is that increasingly, right now actually in Marin, almost a full third of residents in Marin live paycheck to paycheck. It's astonishing. It's astonishing, right? The insecurity of not knowing whether or not you can put food on the table, and that's the sea in which we're swimming. What I want to share with you isn't so much about who we are, what we do, but I want to share with you what we stand for, because I think that's an important piece of the conversation, that we can stand with one another in this space of willingness to crack open a little bit more, to recognize, yes, this is a reality. Yes, we can show up and be present with this reality in a way that holds compassion, the ability to be with suffering, in beauty, in truth, in awareness, and say that my doing so makes a difference, and call others to the making of that difference. And so what I want to call out is, yes, there's the important part of that showing up in the how, and the relational way, and the warmth, and the heart-centered way of showing up and doing that work. And Scott mentioned in my introduction, a big part of what this looks like for me, living this role as a leader in community, is about holding a space that recognizes the woundings and the intergenerational traumas and the layers of oppression and challenge, whether those are systemic or barriers of sort of social constructs and norms inherited by our families, whatever they may be, lack of access to education, all of these things that we know about, that we can be with that in a way that recognizes the need for the services. Those could be safety net services, mental health services, child care services. We need, as a community, to provide and offer those services as we're seeking to overcome the injustices of why we are where we are. And at the same time, what's important leading is to hold a stand deeply committed to the work of equity, the work of doing the what will it take to be the balm, what will it take to hold the medicine. And I mean that also in the Native American sense of the medicine, because there is the deeper work, again, of I must be willing to transform myself in service to another. I have to do my own work. I have to look at myself in a way that makes me even more capable of being there, compassionately with another. And so that idea of equity is firmly rooted in who we are as an agency, and I think that my job and my calling is really about living that strongly. Yes, we will provide service, and yes, we will stand in community, being vocal, being in solidarity, in order to advance toward much more equitable outcomes for everyone who lives in this county. And there's nothing that I could get behind more than that kind of work. And so it's really those two pillars, equity and direct service, that we stand for. And that I think that, as I think even about my own life, personal life, and how I show up, that I'm driven by my sense of purpose and commitment to my values. And at the same time, I give my daughter breakfast every morning, and I provide those services because I love my family. And so I just extend that in a way. And my hope is that we can all put our shoulder to that wheel for transformation toward greater equity in our county, because we certainly have the resources to do so. And I think it's how do we align the will toward being able to do so.
Yeah, every time someone says, well, I don't know if we'd be able to do that, whatever it is here, I think if we can't do it here, where can we do that? If it's not possible here, where there is just so much resource and money, yeah, but so much talent and wisdom and beauty, really so much resource. How could we not make a more beautiful and just and equitable world here? And of course, there's a lot of reasons how we could not. There's a lot of forces at play pushing back against that. And I realized I wanted to tell a story inspired by what you were just saying, Chandra, but I'm worried about telling tales out of school, but I'll risk it. Here we go. So we recently, I've just this last year gotten to know not only my congregation, but lots of folks through the Marin organizing committee. And I know a bunch of you are here tonight, and we went through this process of house meetings over the last year, gathering over 500 people to talk about what are the pressures people are facing in their lives. And the issues that arose out of that were housing, to continue working on affordable housing, on rental protections, to continue working on aging, start working on aging, and to start working on mental health for youth. But there was another thread throughout all of those house meetings around climate change and the environment, and noticing just how heavily this weighs upon us. And in some of the strategizing conversations, there was this question of, well, so this emerged, this kept coming up. Shouldn't that be part of what we're talking about as an agenda moving forward? And one of the layers of that conversation was, there are a lot of people who care about and are working on climate change in the environment in this county. There are not very many people who are working on equality, of economic justice, of racial justice. If we're going to mobilize and do this work in a real way, we need to keep that lens first and look at our anxiety and the pressures of climate change through the lens of equality. Otherwise, whose needs are we serving, right? And as climate change happens, who's going to be, of course, on the front lines of being affected? We know that already, right?
So we have a question to ask one another.
We do.
Get our last little bit together.
Yeah.
Is everybody having fun? Just checking. Okay. We are. I think so, right?
Yeah.
So the question that we have to ask one another is, what do you do personally to replenish your wellspring? Would you like to go first? Because we need replenishing. We definitely do. We all work hard.
We do, and for those of us who are religious leaders, because I noticed there are a number of us in the room today, that we often show up and provide that for others, right? And so one of the things we lose becoming religious leaders is for church for ourselves, right? Sometimes. Sunday morning is not as replenishing an experience as it once was in my life. But I was sharing a little bit with Chandra earlier. A practice of mine is called interplay. That's a playful community practice, improvisational movement and storytelling and singing. And what's so rejuvenating about it, to touch again on this theme, is a place to be raw and vulnerable with others. To be in whatever authentic story or wordless something that's coming up, and to allow that to have expression in my body. That's one of my sources of renewal. Yeah, and maybe I'll have another dimension in a moment. Do you?
Sure. There are many different kinds of things that I do. I think that what really is important to me is time with my family, and making breakfast for my daughter, and just really paying careful attention to the kinds of interactions that I have with my daughter, especially. I think that's really important as a parent, and I see that as spiritual practice. I really do. I have a personal practice, and it's very important for me to have quiet time every day. I like to do the inner work, and I think that my mind is so busy and active and engaged all day, and I'm running around the county, and so that quiet, reflective time is a way to digest and see what emerges out of my dreams and in my morning inspirations in the shower. So I think that's a kind of fuel. And You know, we were joking before we, can I tell them this?
Oh, please.
Okay.
I don't know what it is.
We got offered, we both took a red wine this morning, not this morning, we took a red wine on the way in. And I said, you know, when we get to that last question, I think that's one of my things that I do to replenish. Sometimes I think that the spirit is actually able to be with me in my body and in my sense of connection between my body and my emotional self and my deeper inner self. And sometimes I need that little catalyst and that reminder. And so sometimes I have a glass of wine and then I do my reflective practice. So I'm being very honest with everyone here. But it is an interesting, because so many spiritual traditions utilize red wine in particular. So I think there's a beauty in that. So that's my answer. How are we doing, Scott?
And whatever it is that slows us down, great. That slows us down because there is so much need, right? We're constantly reminded every day. I am addicted to reading the news. I don't know if anybody else shares my addiction, but especially these days, it's a gripping story, and there is so much to do. That there is an endless amount, right? And that the drive, the pull of that all of my feeds that I have so handily available to me would pull me into doing more and more and more. And so I think about a quote of Thomas Merton's. He said that the frenzy, there's a frenzy of the modern world that is itself a form of violence, and the frenzy of the activist. The frenzied activity of the activist is a form of violence that kills the root of the work, that actually cuts off the very root of the work that we're trying to do. And so I try and remind myself of that as the numbers creep up in my inbox that I haven't gotten to, and remember that that's not actually the most important thing. And then I retreat, and I just retreated a couple weeks ago off at a weekend with David White, the poet. It was just so rejuvenating. I'll do a series with him this year. I remember retreating as a child growing up with my church, and how wonderful an experience those kind of these hallmark moments of my childhood of being with community in the woods, where kids were running free and parents were gathering over red wine, and there was a beauty to the world that was heightened in these moments of retreat. And so I do think that that's essential. And I think also I was remembering a really significant retreat for me was with the Faithful Fools in San Francisco. It's a street ministry. And one of the things that they do is bring folks who live in homes most of the time or all the time out to the street to live for a day or for a week. So I spent a week retreating on the street with them once. And it was day 3 or 4 that I realized how at peace and at ease I felt. And I think part of it was not having that constant feed with me. And I think part of it was finding beauty in the hardness of the streets we were sleeping in, but especially in the faces of people who we were having a more authentic communion with, people who the week before and the week after, honestly, I would pass by with nothing more than a look and a smile, right? But to slow down and have a retreat, wherever that might be, whatever that might look like, in the woods or in the Tenderloin, that quality of not doing that is essential to be able to do in an effective, rich way.
So maybe I would just close by saying thank you to all of you. It's been wonderful to be all of me with all of you. And I really appreciate you, Scott. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And I appreciate those who helped to make this possible. So thank you so much.